So thank you, Dr. Karba, and thank you everyone for being here. And it's our privilege to have someone of the stature like yours. And we are so delighted, not just as an organization, I would say, as a sector, it's important to hear the work that has been happening. Earlier this year, Room to Beat started work around implementation science, and we started this work somewhere around early 2024. February is when we started working with Dr. Karga. We first kind of picked his brain, wherein we were trying to grapple with multiple things around science of implementation, then kind of talking about science of leading, talking about policy to practice gaps. So we talked about multiple things with him. And as he's here, and we also wanted to take an opportunity to kind of talk about some of the issues that as a sector we are dealing with. And I would just treat myself honestly on this platform not as the country director for Room to Read, but honestly a representative of the sector. So we have a lot of our people from the sector here who've been working in this space, in the education space. And there are these, I'll start with the basics of defining scale, basically, defining scale for education. And we've heard these concepts like scaling up, building constraints for scaling up, solutions for scaling up. In your view, what do you think you would like to define scaling up in context of education? It's very important to hear how would you like to define scale?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to have been working with Room to Read over the year and thinking about these things. And we have incredible people in the room, and hopefully we can get into the discussion of these things. To start off with that question in terms of what is scale, I think it goes directly to what was in the introduction about the relationship between scale and context. Scaling, as you all know, the concept of scaling is the terminology comes from the business field, from technology, and it's made its way into education. So in that transition from what scale means in business to what scale means in education, there's a context that needs to be taken into consideration. And then when we're talking about scaling, we're scaling something. What is that thing that we're scaling? That has its own context. What is the intervention? And then where are we scaling it? That has a context. So there's multiple layers of context that interacts with scaling. 2 points that I'll like to highlight with this question, and then maybe we can have the other questions or conversations. One is that this transition from business sense of scaling to education sense of scaling. I think it's extremely important to understand that we're not talking about the same thing. In business, there's a clear indicator of when something is successfully scaled. If the profit factor of whatever is being scaled increases, we say it's a successful scaling initiative. Because that indicator is simple, you can measure it, it's one indicator. However, when we get into education, it's a much more complex indicator. There's no one single indicator. And the logic of economies of scale does not apply in the same way. There is definitely indicators of scale that we can measure to some extent, and there is some economies of scale. But getting into the scaling discussion, we have to make sure that we're not talking about business in the same way. We are talking about scaling that is within education, which is the second point. What is it that we are talking about when we're talking about scaling? Is it something new, or is it something that we have always been doing? We had this discussion over the last 2 days in your office. Is there a difference between sustainability and scaling? And what's the relationship between a innovation or an intervention and scaling? So I think getting that cleared up from the beginning is extremely important. So the point being here is that there are general principles of scaling, but every scaling journey needs to answer these questions based on its own context.
Yeah, no, thank you. And just thinking aloud from what you have said, most of the time, and especially when we are talking either with the funding agencies or the people who are doing the impact evaluation, sometimes scale is also misconstituted as reach. So how do we grapple with something like this? And, is it actually a reach number? Is it that how much the system is able to adopt? Because we are also talking about the diverse land of India and in our diversity and the landscape of education that we have. Uh, is it a system that's adopting? Because we have also the largest school system in the world. So, what are we kind of looking at when we talk about scale?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There's definitely part of the scaling matrix is the reach. It's how much quantity you're getting out there. And that's the easiest thing to measure usually. And that's an indicator that donor communities, programs, governments like to stick with, because that is quantifiable. You can touch it, feel it, see it, and understand and either declare that you have scaled or not. But that's only one aspect of it. You could definitely scale something up to reach a whole number of people, but is it really doing what you wanted it initially to do? Is it improving quality of education or not? And that's why at Brookings we like using the term scaling impact, which means that it's the scaling of that initial intention of the intervention and making sure that that is scaled up as well. That when you're reaching more people, it's still an element of that impact is there. And that's another conversation which we had a very good conversation today at your office. The impact could look different.
Yeah.
You could start with one impact at the beginning of that journey and have another impact further down. You don't need to be measuring the same impact indicator throughout that journey, but you definitely need to be measuring some sort of impact. Because if scaling only becomes reach, it's really not meeting the original purpose of what the program was intending to do, which was to improve quality of education in some way.
Yeah, yeah. So, help us just understand this a bit more. When we talk about scale, especially from a perspective of implementation organizations like ours, um, we would demonstrate some excellent program to the governments. And the expectation at the end of it is that the government is going to take it up at some point, either in form of a system integration or a system adoption. Um, at what juncture or what is that tipping point, according to you, from your experience of studying so many educational programs across the globe? What is that tipping point for the governments to take up the program? that is scalable either in a state or a region or a district or a province, the way you would like to take it up. And then, and at that juncture, organization like ours, the implementation agencies, we most of the time kind of look at who will be accountable for it and how is it going to get sustained. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's again a very, very good question and very complex question as well. In terms of the different players in this ecosystem, you have the ministries of education or the official government bodies, and then you have implementing agencies that in many places are NGOs, but in many there's a private sector player in many environments and many contexts. So anything that's outside of the government. I think in the scaling journey, understanding the different roles that each of these entities plays in that overall context and having a scaling vision from the early onset. Engaging in dialogue early on with all of the education actors that we are introducing this intervention, this idea, and what is our scaling vision and what is the roles that each one of these entities plays. So, to come directly to the implementing organization's role, we have to understand that implementing organizations, NGOs, function completely different than governments.
Yeah.
That's another contextual factor. We can't expect how a NGO functions for that program to scale in the same way within the government, because the government's challenges, the complexity is exponentially more than a NGO or a private sector entity. So in many ways, what I think our research has shown is the implementing partners serve as an excellent mechanism for testing out ideas in a contained environment, where implementation is controlled, where complexity is a little bit less, bureaucracy is not as much as within the government, and it's a testing of the idea in terms of how this intervention works. A lot of times the expectation is that from both sides, from the government and from the implementing partner, that this is the journey of scaling of this is going to just kind of be a larger replication of the same program and the way it's being implemented within the government. That's not how it works. The concept gets tested, piloted, whatever you want to use, whatever term, within this contained environment, and then the scaling journey within the government institution will need to adapt and evolve and change in terms of how this program plays out, because there are multiple other factors that come into this equation. So I think the key issue is to have those set expectations on both sides that, yes, we are testing out this new innovative thing that we think is going to work. Our role as an implementing partner is to test it out and see if it works at this level. We will work with you as the government to expand it, but this thing is going to likely, it's a real life organic entity. It's going to need to be adapted, changed as it comes into your system. And the expectation from the government should also, and there's a third party usually, which is the donor community, is that to allow for that time and flexibility for this intervention to be scaled organically, contextually based, and be okay with some level of uncertainty and be okay with changing in real life some of the approaches, some of the goals and markers and indices of what success looks like.
Sure. And so if we have to draw a correlationship, and I'll just jump into structured pedagogy because that's also a work that you've done quite a bit. So, if we kind of try and draw a correlationship between structured pedagogy and its impact on the teachers, in that sense, structured pedagogy has, a lot of components. We would talk about classroom practices, teachers' development, capacity development. We would talk about assessment, supervision. Despite all these components being present in the classroom, sometimes scaling up fails, and it's a challenge. So, what is your opinion on that? I mean, is it in a different context every time that we have to figure out what is failing, or there is a generic assessment or observation that's been done over the years?
So, in general, with pedagogical changes in the classroom, whether it's structured pedagogy, whether it's student-centered pedagogies, whether it's playful learning pedagogies, what we have seen across the board is classroom practice is very difficult to change at the end of the day. There's a lot of reforms and pedagogical practice that come into the ecosystem, but across countries, across contexts, one of the generalizable findings is that it's extremely difficult to change classroom practice and for teachers to take on these new things and implement them. The typical understanding is sort of a deficit model thinking, that the reason why things aren't changing, teachers are lazy, they're not ready for change, there's not enough training, there's not enough resources, there's not enough materials. What we know is all of that is true, but those are not the only factors. In my current research, it's called SPARKS, Strengthening Pedagogical Approaches for Relevant Knowledge and Skills. We focus on what we call IPMs, or invisible pedagogical mindsets. If you think about an iceberg, so the deficit model is the top of the iceberg, what you can see. Under the surface of the water is all of these invisible pedagogical mindsets, which we define as culture. This is beliefs, perspectives, culture in UNESCO's sense of the term. There is the educational ecosystem, and then there is the prevalent learning theories that teachers come into the space with. If we're trying to do structured pedagogies and we're not dealing with these other underlying factors, we will not be able to change pedagogical practice, because the logic that if we just ask teachers to change their practice, they're able to and they're willing to change it is a flawed logic. We know that from decades of research that this is, if it was working, then we wouldn't have this conversation. But we know it's not working. And the part of the reason is that we need to expand our perspectives, not only of what are the factors, but who are the responsible parties. If the system doesn't change, but we want the teacher to change, if the assessment system is still testing certain things that the teacher is responsible for, but we're introducing whether it's structured pedagogies or playful learning or something of that nature, the teacher, they can't change, because then they would leave a lot of the students behind. If the assessment of the teacher is tied to regimented approaches, in which if they're looking at being assessed on completing a set curriculum, but we're asking them to do these new pedagogical practices, that's unrealistic. And if there is a misalignment in communication, our pre-service programs are saying this is how people learn, and they're giving them one perspective. Our curriculum has another perspective about how learning takes place. And then we have things that teachers come in with themselves from their experiences, their growing up, what they have been. So that's how they think it's. And then we have all these other in-service programs that say, okay, and then usually we have multiple a teacher is exposed to, and I was learning this is true in India, but I've seen it across the board. There are multiple organizations that are teaching different ways of doing things. So there's a complete misalignment. That misalignment, it's logical that teachers are going to stick with what they think is the safest path forward for them, and not venture into new ways that might change in 2-3 years when the project is over, or they might increase their work for this and then get reprimanded for not doing the other things that they were supposed to do. So those are some general thoughts.
No, I think this is well said, and we all know that the teacher is forever overwhelmed, and most of us sitting here are also responsible for it, because we would go and try and give them a new tip every time. So clearly that's the reason. But this brings me to another point wherein we talk about scalability and sustainability almost in the same breath these days. And I was just going through this program, USAID, that implemented, this was again a basic education program in Malawi, and the other one was Kenya. Malawi was started in 2011, and Kenya started in 15-16 sometime. And the numbers that came out in terms of course, they were like huge programs. They were at scale, though Malawi started in small pockets and then kind of became very big at a later stage. After 11 years of the program, it was figured out that only 20% of the things that were taught were adopted by the system. So when I say system, teacher is part of the system. Whereas a program like Kenya, there was 80% of the adoption. So, and just reflection that we talk about teacher being overwhelmed. And I also see behavior plays a big role in all of this. So, is there a correlationship there? Is it a system that's not able to adopt it? Is it your luck that plays into it as an implementation agency, that you can be just lucky and sometimes you are not? But what are those systemic levers that one need to keep in mind to make sure that your programs are both scalable? Because scalability is only till when you are there, but sustainability is only when you leave. And that's what is more important. So how do we kind of manage something like that?
Yeah, that's a good point, and being clear about terms in terms of what we mean by scalability or scaled initiatives, and then what's sustainable. What do we mean by that? And I think first of all, people tend to not come to terms with this. And that goes back to that original point that if we want reach, but it should mean scaling it up to scaling the impact of it as well. And then the last idea is that it will become sustainable, that after it's scaled up, the system will continue to do this. So first of all, between intervention and scaling, there's a pathway, and there's not one single pathway. Whether that pathway is clear, whether it's scaling only the reach or impact, this affects how long all of this is interacting in a live ecosystem. This impacts how much sticking power it has to the system. Once it's scaled, is it scaled in a way that is co-developed, co-created? Is it scaled in the way that the government is willing, able, and there are champions in the system that would keep it going? This would determine sustainability of it. And that pathway and the pathway between intervention, these are all context specific. So I think there's no single answer in terms of, I think it's a part of all of those things. There's some luck, there's some pre-preparation, there's some creation of spaces and dialogue, and there is this need for looking at these things from multi-perspectives and multi-angles, making sure that this is, because from that path of intervention to sustainability, there's a technical element of it, certainly.
Yeah.
But as it moves through that trajectory, there's a political element, there's a social element, there's a value element. So being able to align all of those, and sometimes that is engineered to some extent, but a lot of times it is that when those windows of opportunity align, in one place it really sits, and in this other place, those windows are not aligning. And our immediate gut reaction is, well, technically we know this is working, why isn't it being adopted in both places? But we need to step back and realize that this is not only a technical activity. This is a human activity that has all of those elements intertwined with it.
No, absolutely. And I think for us, that opportunity, window of opportunity for us is the Nipun Bharat mission that we are all working towards. And this is our window, and we're very hopeful that in our education landscape, we would be able to really showcase some scale. I have read some of your work, and you have been a big advocate of, context agnostic solutions. So, keeping that in mind, we often desire to have very standardized and very context neutral solutions that we want to give to the system so as they can adopt it. And so, while designing these models, what principles should we keep in mind to keep it both relevant and, so as it can be also adopted?
So I think this is a challenge of our time in general. Prior to coming into the education space, I was a chemist. And I'm learning that all of us had some other trajectories and then we ended up in education. The way that I look at this issue of generalizability and the need for contextualized approaches is, I look at it in the same way of the wave-particle duality. So the wave-particle duality being that electrons, if you're looking at them, if they're being observed, they're a particle. If you're not, it's functioning as a wave. Understanding that both of those things are part of the reality is very important. And in the education space, how I see that related to what we're talking about is that we usually create these false camps. It's FLN versus SEL, socio-emotional learning versus foundational literacy and numeracy. It is generalizable approaches, best practices versus contextual approaches, and everything has to be context, and there's nothing that can be. Having the ability to hold both of those two-tier thinking is extremely, I think, important in a complex world. We have multi-crises that education is trying to address. We need to make sure that we're learning from our collective experiences and taking some generalizable learnings, but we need to make sure that those are context appropriate. And in my work in both in research and pedagogies, I've come to this point in my career that moving away from best practices in the sense of what works and let's copy it everywhere, because we know it doesn't work. The what works doesn't work. And even the FCDO they're trying to rebrand that to how works versus what works. It's extremely important to make sure that the interventions are meeting the problems of the system. A lot of time it's a good intervention, but that's not what the system is having a problem with. That's not the highlight of, it's a solution, but for the wrong problem in many cases. So I think the context factor is extremely important, but that doesn't mean that we don't learn from other experiences, which is where I think the field is right now, trying to figure out what is it that we can generalize. I think we are at a point where we understand that prescriptive approaches of techniques is not what is generalizable, because those techniques are specific and context driven. I think where we're moving towards is understanding generalizable principles, concepts, approaches, more abstract. For example, the structured pedagogy. There's elements of structured pedagogy that could be drawn out for every context, that we can say, okay, kind of laying out approaches and kind of having steps, and these things are helpful. But what does that mean in my context, and how can I connect it to my current environment, and what is it within my current environment that works? Education is not only 200 years old with modern schooling.
Yeah.
Education is thousands, it's as long as human history.
Yeah.
And just throwing away all that learning that we have in sustainable approaches outside of the schooling system and only looking at innovation. That's why I keep switching between innovation and intervention, because I have a bit of a problem with the term innovation, because there's a assumption that every innovation is good. So the drawing upon our heritage, drawing upon what has worked in context, improving it, adapting it, evolving it, mixing it with approaches that are coming in. So ideally, structured pedagogy in India would look different than structured pedagogy in Africa. And ideally, a structured pedagogy in one state in India would look different. But this requires a very dynamic, adaptive system. And this is where the problem comes. Systems are very difficult to become dynamic. And this is, I think, where we're at as a field.
Sure. And do you think are there any lessons from other large-scale programs, educational programs globally that one we could learn from who've been striking this balance?
I think, again, there are general principles, and there are lessons, and we say this in education, but we seldom really uh, uh, practice it. We learn more from failed attempts than from successful attempts, and many times. So I think drawing upon why things haven't worked is one lesson. In terms of pedagogy, we have decades-long approaches, and I haven't seen a study that combines all the investment globally that has gone into pedagogy, but generally we know that there is a lot of money, billions and trillions of dollars that have been spent in changing classroom practice, and classroom practice hasn't changed. This is a learning that we can take and figure out why. Some of the general principles is because it hasn't taken context into consideration. It's been isolated approaches. For example, let's change the curriculum and hope pedagogy is going to change. Let's do some in-service training and hope that pedagogy is going to change. Let's do these things. Let's focus on what we can measure. We know that if we really want to change pedagogy, we have to take a holistic approach. That's one. Systems that we know or we think are working well, we can learn from them as well. I've been giving the examples of the darlings of the education space. Finland is, I'm sure everybody's heard about Finland, that they're doing very good. And why, first of all, there's questions about whether they're really the best system out there or not. I won't get into that. But in terms of what we know about it is that it is a very comprehensive system. It's not only about their education system. It's education meaning the schooling institution. It's their overall infrastructure in society that from child rearing to the supports that exist outside of the system, to the fact that it's not a very complex. If you compare Finland and India, the complexity is exponentially more in India. So simpler systems tend to be easier to be more successful. Cuba has similar numbers on PISA and TIMSS as Finland. And one of the things there as well is that Cuba has a very systematic approach, an ecosystem approach to supporting education from birth all the way to elderly adult education. So I think there are these, the fact that let's not keep trying to do the same things and expecting new results. We know certain things don't work. Let's try to figure out why. Let's take an ecosystem approach. And I like using the word ecosystem rather than a system, because systems has an engineering linear connotation that if I do this, and it works in engineering very well. But education is not a engineered system. It's more akin to an ecosystem, ecological, biological ecosystem that functions differently. Let's take an ecosystem approach. Let's make sure that we have clear understanding of why we're putting in interventions, what the goals are, that we all understand the purposes, we all speak the same language. And the last point being, education is a multi-tiered social, political, moral, ideological act. Let's make sure that all of those voices are around the table when we are having educational interventions, because a lot of times the things fails because it might be ideological, but technically very unsuccessful. It might have some technical advantages, but it's not aligning with all these other factors. So those are some general takeaways that at least I have in my mind.
No, thank you. And I feel challenged as a sector that if we have not been able to change the classroom practice for so many years, what's wrong we are doing, and we'll not talk about what is working, but let's talk about what's not working for sure. So you touched upon assessments, and while assessments are they're key in evidence-based planning, but often we have come to a realization, especially in the classroom, that this leads to teach to the test mentality. And, with structured and attitudinal changes are needed to foster that kind of an environment. That has been one of our challenges, and I would say that that challenge exists almost in all different type of projects that we have tried working on.
I think as an ecosystem approach, the strongest lever to change a system is to change the assessment system. Because at the end of the day, whatever is being measured is what is going to be taught to, what is going to matter at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And unless we address what we're assessing and how we're assessing it, not only for the students, but how we're assessing our teachers, how we're assessing our systems, how we're assessing our project in terms of whether it's the government assessing projects or donors that are funding. There's usually a huge misalignment between aspirations of what we want and how we talk about it in the rhetoric and what we are actually assessing. So if we want to change a system, the first thing would be to change the assessment system. That would help fast forward a lot of the reforms that we're aspiring to.
Sure. I think we want to foster an environment of genuine learning, so as the teachers are able to use it for effective planning, use it as a tool instead of really, feeling pressured about it. I've been given a time check, but I'll still hop onto the favorite question of the sector, which is around the role of EdTech and AI, especially in the low and middle income context. So, and I'll just ask you, what do you think? Is it really feasible?
Well, I think so. It is a sexy question in the field. That's just what it says.
Well, sitting on a donor with, they just want to ask me, what is your take on the EdTech? So, and if I sit with the government, they want us to implement technology. Right. So,
I think it's important to just step back and realize that this is not new with AI. This is a cycle that the interaction of ed tech, whether it was radios at one point, then it moved to computers, then it moved to laptops, and tablets and all of these things, and now AI is the big thing. I think the trajectory of all of them, there are certain trends, certain learnings that we can draw on for AI that goes back. Number one is that usually ed tech is very much connected with this whole issue of scalability. Mm-hmm. One of the problems of scaling in education that business doesn't have or technology doesn't have is that you can't replicate features. Yeah. You can't scale features at the rate and the time that you want. So this is where edtech comes in a lot of times, thinking that we can overcome this problem by introducing technology to replace either part of the teacher or the whole teacher. And both of these things have happened. There are a lot of examples of completely trying to replace teachers. We know that doesn't work. I have no question that AI is going to have the same fate. You can't replace teachers. The other part of it is that doesn't mean ed tech doesn't have a place in education. Figuring out how ed tech can be a supplement to the educational system, that's intimately tied to context. It's about connectivity, it's about infrastructure, it's about power.
Yeah.
We have many examples of very well-meaning projects that were in millions of dollars, and they didn't foresee that if we introduce computers to this community that doesn't have electricity, it's a waste of money.
Yeah.
And we have had many, many examples of that where millions of dollars have been spent and computers are collecting dust. So figuring out how to incorporate ed tech is one of the most contextual factors in this. The last point that I would like to make is usually when we think about ed tech, we think about ed tech either replacing or supplementing instruction. And we forget about the fact that there's this whole other side of the educational system, that's the lower hanging fruit, which is ed tech as an administrative tool. How can we use ed tech to reduce the burden on education administrators, whether it's at the ministry level, at the district level, at monitoring level, EMIS level? How can we use ed tech to reduce the administrative burdens on schools, on principals, on all the way to the teachers? So I think making sure that we think of ed tech as a tool and use it smartly based on the context, and make sure that we are thinking beyond instruction. I think ed tech would be really helpful and useful. They do things that makes life easier. But a lot of times we use it in ways and aspire to use it in ways that are just completely counterproductive.
Sure. So let's ensure the technology is used as to complement the teacher, not to replace the teacher.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So all right, I have been given a lot of remarks from Shakti and here. I would really like to open it up for the audience for the questions. There could be follow-up questions on the on what we were just discussing, or any new questions.
Sir, my name is Shalit. I work with Central Square Foundation. Really glad to be part of this discussion as well. I think one thing that I got really interested in, especially because we work closely with governments on FLM specifically, when you spoke about scaling with the government, you said you have to sort of find a midway with them, right? You have to adapt when you're working with stakeholders. So when you're in that process, how do you ensure that you don't sort of lose the integrity of the program and the impact, scaling impact, while you're trying to accommodate and adapt as well? How do you ensure that?
We spent the last 2 days at Room to Read discussing this. So I'm going to share sort of our collective understanding of this. So I think there are certain principles to keep in mind just in general. One is what I started off by saying, that making sure that it's an open dialogue about scaling, and it's not sort of a top-down approach or an imposed approach. It's something that people feel that there's a value for that intervention. And sometimes that takes a lot of time to build, and being okay with giving that time to build the demand. And sometimes there's no demand and you just have to acknowledge that and move along. So doing that, there are strategies in terms of what we have seen. For example, champions are extremely important. Making sure that there are champions on both sides, on multi-levels, on multi-sectors that see, again, the value of the intervention and can be ambassadors for it and move it forward in these different arenas. Having a scaling success vision. What does a successful scale up of an intervention mean? I think that's a very critical area in which you start off very excited at the beginning, and then people drift apart because they have completely different visions of what scaling of that intervention means. A shared vision and based on reality, on context, and pragmatic understanding of what's possible. So these are some principles, and there's other principles, I think, in the literature that we can draw upon. I think another thing that came from today's discussion at Room to Read that I think is really important is this idea of impact at a small scale, especially within, so I'm going to use some of Room to Read's terminology. So the I do phase, this is what Room to Read is using in terms of where the implementing partner is doing something within their environment. Impact there is more concentrated. It's easier to figure out, and there's an easy connection between impact of the intervention and learning of children. When we go to scale, we're introducing a time factor, we're introducing a complexity factor. Impact is going to be different as it moves along this journey. And many times that impact, it becomes very difficult to measure the impact in terms of children's learning, because for an educational system to change and for that change to trickle down to the student, that takes time. Many times that takes decades. If it's a simple intervention, it might take years for that to trickle down across the system. So in that scaling journey, part of the understanding is redefining impact at every scale, at every stage of the scale. So whereas at the beginning phase and the I do phase, it might be what it's doing to children's learning, which is the proof of concept. As it moves up, the impact might be how it's being adopted by the ministry. How is it being adopted in the pre-service and service training? How is it being adopted in the curriculum? Is it changing policy? So I think constantly being adaptive and iterative in terms of both the vision, the goal, and what we consider as success is important. A lot of times what happens is we're expecting the same impact, to see the same impact in the same time frame that we see in the I do phase. When a year later we're within the government, we're like, why isn't this classroom changing? Well, logically, it hasn't made its way into the classroom yet. So
I think in our work as well, we're moving further into what's looking at process indicators. Said I have seen, sometimes there is misalignment because say the entry point that we might have had in an intervention only had access to say one element of the system, and sometimes those elements of the system don't also speak to each other. Like say, for example, we might have come in with a pedagogical method, and we are speaking with the department that takes care of pedagogy, but the department that makes textbooks is completely separate, and these departments are talking to each other. So just keen to hear from your experiences, your research as to what else to do to Because sometimes those elements also don't speak to each other.
Yeah, so a couple of months back, we were at the UN General Assembly's week, and there was all these meetings that take place on the side. And we did a couple of sessions on collaboration. And the big takeaway of that was collaboration is hard. There are no easy shortcuts. And the way that's related to, I think, your question is, this issue of misalignment is so prevalent, but it's such a difficult problem that we kind of sweep it under the rug. And one factor that is causing this systemic failure, because again, referring back to the UN General Assembly, we know that we're not going to reach SDG 4 by 2030. We know that the systems of our institutionalized educational systems are failing. We know that there is pre-COVID, we were estimating 100-year gap between sort of high-income countries and low-income countries in terms of these indicators of achievement. And that 100 years being that it would take 100 years for some of these countries to come to the level of where some of these higher income countries are, but then they would have already moved up. So we know that the system is not working. And one big factor of that is this misalignment. But in order for that to be addressed, it requires us to have more patience, be open to slower rates. We are infatuated with this scaling of growth. And we know that we can grow systems very quickly. The last place that I worked at was Afghanistan, and in a matter of 20 years, we went from 500,000 students to 10.5 million. In India's terms, those are minuscule numbers. But for the context of Afghanistan, that was a huge exponential growth. But we also saw that quality deteriorated because there are real life trades that you're making. If we really are serious about improving our systems, first of all, we need to redefine our ecosystems of education. I'm a big advocate that we need to get away from this formal, informal, non-formal educational spaces. It's about education. Wherever we can do education, let's do it. And then make sure that these investments that we're making into the system, it's better to have more thought out investments that might impact a smaller number over a longer term that grows organically, rather than fooling ourselves in many ways and reaching higher numbers but losing our initial intent. So that misalignment is every single country that I've worked with, just the misalignment between pre-service and in-service is so big that if we can just address that issue, and then there's the whole curriculum issue, that the curriculum department is not speaking with pre-service and in-service. So if we really want to do the reforms, we got to take these difficult steps.
Hi, my name is Robin Sarkar, and thank you for this wonderful conversation. Taking this exact point forward, I'm from Shipyard Foundation, and we've been working on ICT-based intervention in rural area again. And we end up changing the goalposts because by the time we create a program, take it to the ground, take it to the masses, the actual curriculum changes. And again, cycle rolls back every time. So I would like to know your thoughts on that one. And the second is, you talk very clearly about scaling, but scaling objectives are very different at the government level and at the level where we are working. We may want to do it for the masses, for the mass enhancement, for the education. So they would like to do it for just the geography, nothing else, just geography. So how do we match these two objectives and get into a common ground? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is in a way the same problem of misalignment of visions, misunderstanding of visions in many ways. Creating more spaces for collaborative research, collaborative program designs, collaborative implementation strategies overall, the ecosystems, is, I think, the way that at least we see as one path to start addressing some of these concerns. And as I said, collaboration is hard, because people come into the collaborative table with different motivations, and it takes time to build the trust. And one of my colleagues has coined the statement that you expand and you scale at the speed of trust. And that's your bottleneck in many times, is if there's a trusting environment, those things could be addressed. And then the other factor is the being content and happy with our spheres of influence. Sometimes on the implementing front, we as implementing partners, there's a sphere that we have influence over, and we're doing a good job. It goes back to that original point. What is the role of scaling of different partners? If an implementing partner is doing a proof of concept on an intervention and it's working, I think that's very good. But sometimes we become impatient and say, the government should take this on and expand it in the same way. Yes, there's a lot of issues with governments, but what we fail to see is that the complexity of government environments, and we talked about this today at Room to Read as well, is a small decision to change some practice within the system. Let's not even think about the big policymakers, just a medium, lower level, district level politician. For them to make that change, first of all, they have to go through a bureaucracy and take the risk of, and the energy and the fight to somebody to change that bureaucracy. It's likely going to change the work environment of several people. It's going to have an impact from that perspective. Yes, they're pretty confident that it'll work, but it could fail as well, and it could have an impact for them as well. It could end up making somebody's life difficult. It could end up losing somebody's job. So there's all these political risks, social risks, moral risks that this person has to take for that small change to take place. So I think realizing and understanding that, yes, we can prove a concept in this environment, in this context, but let's give ownership to the government to take it up at the rate and the speed and the form and the way that makes sense for their environment. And it could look completely different at the end. And I think that's okay.
Thank you so much. There's just so much to reflect about. And in the words that you just spoken, I kept hearing the word time, speed, trust building, and which also means then, adaptive, iterative. All of these words mean that you have to invest a lot of time and have patience for something to get that scale for impact and sustainability. In fact, one of the questions that I'm now thinking about is what is it that we should be really working towards? Scalability or sustainability? Is it an either or question? And how do you also then talk to donors who are wanting things to be done in a certain time frame?
Very patient.
Yeah, and then on the other hand, there is the complexity of the government where you may have found a champion within the system, and 1 year down the road, the champion is gone. There is this whole conundrum of issues which constantly are challenging you while you are, doing the adaptation and the iterations of the design. And another thing that strikes me is, and it's a conversation that is now happening, is how much do we actually involve our teachers in these conversations? Because they're the ones who are actually the front line. They're the ones who are delivering, or they're the ones who are engaging with the children on a daily basis. We're just designing things and taking it to them. How much are they part of that design conversation? So what are, any reflections or thoughts?
I think they're the central levers, and in this conversation, nothing can really move in a positive or any direction without, well, it can move in a negative direction, without involving teachers in terms of what is their lived reality and what do they see. So I think in the conversation, teachers are a must. Involving parents, involving communities, involving the students themselves in the conversation. The larger the conversation, obviously, the better. But again, the slower the process. Which comes to this idea of why are we having this problem, first of all? What this fight between time and growth, and there's an image of where we want to be and an image of where we are at and what we're doing. I think a lot of this is related to this idea of educational transfer and that whole literature with that there's a model that everybody has to adopt. And some people are ahead, some people are behind. The people that are behind have to catch up. And there's a reality to that, there's a logic to that, but then there's the other part of it that the people who are successful, these things grew organically at their own pace. So this is a general development question that has all those angles of what does it mean sociopolitically, what does it mean for the growth of the country and everything else. Going back to sort of the initial conversations in terms of what is sustainability, what is scalability, I think they don't have to be, I think they can be a continuum, but many times they are unfortunately opposites. Many times it's somebody's desire to scale up something that the system is not ready to absorb and sustain. And that conflict, and if you add, unfortunately, the donor community in this environment, if the donor community has certain things that they think should be done in in the same way everywhere, this problem gets exacerbated. It becomes multiplied, it gets, going back to the example of Finland, one of the things that Finland has going for it is it's not very donor dependent. So the number of players are different, so it's sort of this collaboration coming to an agreement about the vision, the mission, what we're looking for our educational system, it's more clear. So I think the last point that I would like to make is, and again, this is all collective discussions that we had within Room to Read. We automatically think that when things are not changing, it's a bad thing. It could be systems resilience that they're not changing despite all of the, it could be that those things that are not changing is what is really working. And I think part of our job as educational researchers, educational implementers, is to step back, introduce some humility into our understanding of the field. And it's usually not changing first because the teachers are not changing it, and then the system administrators are not changing it. And we have to get away from this blanket understanding that these are all either people who don't understand, people who are lazy, all of those negative deficit models, which I'm sure is true for some portion of any population. But if things are not changing, let's listen to them, and maybe there's value there, and then maybe change our approaches to align with that rather than fighting it.
All right, we'll just take this as the one last question, because we'll break it for the tea, and then the questions will be probably asked during the tea time. Yes.
Yeah. I did. Yes. Okay.
Two questions.
Dr. Qargha, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this conversation. I'm Rajesh Singh from Badmani AI. We work with the government to integrate AI solutions for problem solving. So you brought up a very interesting point now and even prior, that it seems that they're designing solutions for manual systems in NGOs, and then we try to port it to the government scale up, which is typically a non-manual system, right? Because it's much bigger and it has a lot of levers and it squeaks, right? It takes time and it's more expensive. So are there specific design principles that would suit the non-malleability of a government system?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very complex question as well. The reason I'm pausing is I would like to add a couple of other elements to those assumptions. I don't think that government systems are non-malleable. I think they change in different ways. So one design principle is to make sure that we understand government systems. And part of that understanding is understanding that government systems and bureaucracies are a non-linear system. Implementing partner organizations seem to be a little bit more linear, not completely. But when we get into government systems, they're a complex non-linear system. And by non-linear, what I mean is that there is at least 2-3 elements that don't follow sort of what we would like for systems to follow. One is there are multiple motivations. There's not a singular motivating factor within any government and within any level of the government. People, whether it's education or anything else, from a public policy perspective, people do things for multiple reasons. And political, social, and within the educational system, we tend to assume that there's only one purpose for education. That has never been the case. Human capital is the dominant rationale nowadays. Prior to that, it was building national identity. Prior to that, it was sort of liberation in certain Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, liberation and all that terms. There's the human development, humanistic perspectives. There's the growth as an individual. All of these things are happening at the same time, even within educational goals. But then you add other aspects. So it's not understanding that it's non-linear in that perspective, understanding that there's no clear pathway in governments to understand, if I do an intervention here, there's X, Y, Z, and then it gets there. The pathways are varied, the pathways are multiple, and it becomes very difficult to draw a line from the top policy to the classroom. And then time. Governments have to address things in terms of time-sensitive issues that are causing the government to focus on certain aspects of the system. And it's usually not, it doesn't have to be the most pressing technical problem. It could be other issues. So I think to your question, the overall general principle that I would recommend as one way, this is not the only way, is to really design with these complexities in mind and draw upon literature that brings in ed tech, educational development, education transfer, and public policy and political science. Because without those multiple frameworks of understanding, any one of these frameworks will probably lead you to a lesser degree of success. Because if you don't understand the political environment of the government, you're not gonna succeed.
I don't have a question, I just wanted to supplement, and of course, I want to see it more in terms of, because we started off with the context as we were looking at it, and every context is going to be very different. And when we are looking at the ecosystems in terms of when we are looking about and talking about the early literacy initiatives, that would be very varied in terms of the different scenarios. Because there are many, at least in the Indian context when we are looking at it, it's more in terms of the oral tradition of learning which had been there for a very long time, and we still find that it's still continuing. And also you said that, how do we align with the different systems? I think it's much more important to be also documented in the different contexts. I think would be very interesting to look at. Because even in Finland, we have found that there are different contexts they are also working on, and especially in the rural areas where the population is very limited.
Right.
We have found that the different kinds of examples are now being also being documented. So I think on that note, I think it's more in terms of that how we are looking at the collaboration of the different stakeholders, and also the real purpose, in terms of whether we are really, again, your first point, where you looked at the business and the education, and then how do you see scaling? I think that would be more important to be get.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think, Mona, you just summarized. So makes more sense. I would just like to close the session and would encourage all of you to connect with Dr. Qargha for any more questions around the tea time. So thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Qargha. It is our pleasure and honor On behalf of the entire sector, I would like to express our gratitude to you for the work that you are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be amongst all of you. And thank you to Room to Read for facilitating. I've learned a lot.
Thank you. The learning is mutual.
Yeah.
So, thank you.